It is my honor to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Loren Kreutz. Since 2013, Dr. Kreutz has been on the faculty of the History of Art Department at the University of California, Berkeley. Prior to her appointment there, she served in the same capacity at the University of Wisconsin. She received her undergraduate degree at the University of Chicago and her doctorate in the History and Theory of Art from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Cambridge, Mass. She has written a book entitled Creative Composites, Modernism, Race, and the Stieglitz Circle, which I can attest is a must-read for anyone interested in American modernism. She has published on John Stuart Curry, Modernism in New York, Arthur Dove. Her newest publication is entitled Cultivating Citizens, the Regional Work of Art in the New Deal Era, and treats the idea of regionalism, making her a wonderful speaker on the king of Midwestern regionalists, Grant Wood. Her talk tonight focuses on the personal and professional relationship between Grant Wood and H.W. Janson. Both men taught in the art department at the University of Iowa. They fought constantly over how to teach painting, how to judge its quality, where art should come from, and what purpose it served. Professor Kreutz's talk is entitled Grant Wood, H.W. Janson, and the Case of the Naked Chicken. Please welcome Loren Kreutz.
So I'm deeply honored to be speaking at the Art Institute. I first discovered art history in Chicago as an undergraduate at the U of C, and some of the most exciting moments of my studies have happened here. Today, I'm going to be talking about one of the few artists I knew before I showed up as a naive undergraduate in Chicago, the Iowa painter Grant Wood, the artist who created American Gothic, which of course you see here in 1930. What is perhaps one of the best known, widely reproduced, appropriated, and parodied paintings in the world. Here I show you a few random examples from the web. I'll be talking about Wood's relationship with and interpretation by German immigrant art historian H.W. Janson, a name that may also sound familiar. Janson's best-selling textbook, which he co-authored with his wife Dora, was released in 1962 and is now in its 8th edition and has been translated into many languages. Here you see the Croatian edition, the 4th edition on the bottom. So I want to start today with an odd, much lesser-known essay. In 1955, more than a decade after Grant Wood's death, Janson published an essay entitled The Case of the Naked Chicken. And I show you the first page of that essay here. He published it in the College Art Journal. Janson's essay traced the composition of Wood's 1938 lithograph and 1940 painting, Adolescent, to a detail in the chiaroscuro woodcut Diogenes, executed around 1520 by the Italian printmaker Ugo da Capri, after a lost painting by the famed Mannerist Parmigianino. The 16th century woodcut, which I show you here in full, referred to the ancient Greek philosopher Plato's definition of man as a featherless biped, and the response to it by the Cynic philosopher Diogenes of Sinope, who attacked Plato's definition by displaying a plucked rooster and proclaiming it to be Platonic man, since it too was a featherless biped. And here you can see the chicken in the back, or Plato's man. So by situating Wood's American art in a European context, Janson continued the critique of Wood he had started in the 1940s. As I'll show, by way of this seemingly innocuous and kind of funny connection, Janson continued to argue that regionalism misguidedly prized factual content and substituted nationalist, potentially fascistic, subject matter for universal aesthetic concerns. Although Janson's attacks, which I'll talk more about, proved instrumental in the post-war eclipse of regionalism, in his 1955 essay, Janson struck a kind of charitable tone towards Wood and his work. He referred to these chickens as diverting and witty subjects. Janson acknowledged that dead plucked chickens were quite common in still life and genre paintings. But live plucked chickens, he pointed out, were much rarer in the history of art. He cited this precedent, which you see on the right, claiming that a relationship between the two works could, quote, hardly be doubted, for the two birds share not only their nudity, but also a strikingly similar pose, end quote. Janson pointed out that Edgar Wind, an eminent German-born British art historian, had published an essay on Diogenes in 1938 in the Journal of the Warburg Institute, connecting the naked chicken in the Mannerist print with the ancient story. Noting that Wood's lithograph and Wind's article appeared in the same year, Janson traced what seemed like a tidy origin for adolescence, even joking that the future art historian might consider Wood as a learned student of the classics. Here, Janson and Wind relied on an influential method of art history called iconography that examines the meaning or content of works of art, particularly the repetition of subjects across time. In this, Janson followed the, at the time, quite recent tradition of the Hamburg School of Art History, particularly as undertaken by the art historian Edwin Panofsky, who had mentored Janson first in Hamburg and then in the United States after both men fled Nazi Germany. However, Janson complicated his findings in the case of the naked chicken by admitting that his claims contradicted Wood's own explanation of the composition's origin. Wood's biography recounted the artist's anecdote about having grown fond of a baby chick that he purchased for an oval portrait of his sister, Nan. And you see she's holding the chick here. A 1931 work, which you see on the right here. The artist kept the chicken in his Iowa studio until it choked on a rubber cigarette in 1933. When Wood's mother prepared the chicken for dinner by plucking it, the pathetic sight of his pet's featherless body, Wood claimed, had moved him to begin the drawings that resulted ultimately in adolescence. Wood also claimed that he had a special sympathy for chickens, particularly the Plymouth Rock breed. And I show you a photograph, for those of you not up on your chickens, I show you a photograph of one of those on the left, and also Wood's 1931 painting featuring a Plymouth Rock hen, The Appraisal, on the right. Wood recalled that his earliest, no longer extant, childhood drawings consisted of series of clustered arcs, abstractions that his mother understood were Wood's own personal symbol for the variegated feathers of Plymouth Rock hens. Wood remembered rubbing tallow on the birds' naked wings as a child to relieve their sunburn as their first feathers grew in. Now, this story is one example of Wood's frequent writing on the origin of his paintings in his childhood memories, which he regarded as, quote, deeper and more lasting than anything that came later, end quote. Yet as the story of the studio chicken suggests, however, Wood did not paint entirely from distant memory. Wood searched for antiques and exemplary specimens from the late 19th century of his childhood to use as props in his paintings, and transformed his subjective remembrances into seemingly objective representations of these objects and animals, painted in a flat, potentially decorative style. Disputing Wood's anecdotal account here, Janson asked how the plucked dead chicken had become a live one. He urged skepticism towards Wood's stories and those of his biographer, dismissing them as tales artists commonly tell, quote, to explain art in terms of everyday experience, end quote. Janson allowed that he couldn't prove that Wood had viewed the 16th century woodcut, but he asserted that the artist could have seen it almost anywhere, he says. From a museum in Munich, where Wood spent 3 months in 1928, to the library of Iowa's Department of Art, where Wood taught from 1934 until his death in 1942. Janson conceded that Wood might not have understood the image's meaning as Vin did, as a cynic's image of man. He could have noticed it, Janson argued, however, so that after the death of his studio pet, Janson claimed, quote, "The memory of the plucked rooster came alive to him, and although by then he had probably forgotten that he had seen it, or even that he had seen it, where he had seen it, or even that he had seen it." For Janson, the resemblance between the two birds belied or even contradicted Wood's claim that his was an independent creation. The bird's sameness, Janson wrote, could not be coincidence alone. Nor in Janson's argument could the similar poses be based on the artist's independent observation of a standing featherless chicken in the world. Calling himself a, quote, skeptical art historian, Janson turned his iconological study to Wood's adolescence into a kind of manifesto on art's origins, insisting that the artwork, quote, reflects other works of art rather than reality, end quote. A biographical note printed, you can see it here, at the bottom of the case of the naked chicken, mentioned that Janson was teaching in the mid-50s at NYU. But more than a decade earlier, he had taught at the University of Iowa, alongside Wood. Here, Janson did not mention the acrimony that had marked the years between 1938 and 1941 that he had spent in Iowa's Department of Art. Disagreements about the nature of art and how it should be taught, as well as more personal matters, pitted Wood against Janson and other members of the faculty, particularly the department's chair, the art historian Lester Longman. Janson continued to question Wood's use of direct observation, an attack that he had begun at the University of Iowa. But he moved his critique into a new register by claiming for art history an essential role in the origin of contemporary artworks. In dismissing Wood's personal anecdote that laid out the factual basis of adolescence, the case of the naked chicken did not recur to Janson's influential articles of the 1940s, which linked Wood's regionalism with the forms and ideologies favored by Nazi art experts. Here I'm showing you key texts from 1943 and 1946 on the left, which I'll return to, that make these claims. However, Janson's claims in his articles of the 1940s and the 1955 essay, I want to argue, are inextricably linked. Asserting regionalism's international character, Janson repeatedly connected the Midwest movement not only with Mannerist prints offering a cynical image of man, but also with the movement of German Neustaatlichkeit, or New Objectivity painting. An amorphous German style of painting that turned after World War I from expressionism and abstraction to a new model of realism. Here I'm showing you a few examples of it from collections in the United States. Some of you may have seen. Although the German painters of the movement included those aligned with the political right, here on the right side of the screen, and on the political left, here on the left, Janson found in Wood's paintings a formal and conceptual resemblance to the right that tied it to fascism. Here, Janson was thinking not only of Wood's chicken, but also of his landscapes, including Stone City, which I show you now in relationship to another New Objectivity painting. This is a relationship that I'll talk more about, but here I want to underscore the crucial point that Janson objected to Wood's claim that he made paintings by relaying facts from his life, and that this objection to a supposed objectivity of representation tied Janson's 1955 iconographic arguments about chickens to his early statements about the potentially fascistic character of Wood's work. In the case of the naked chicken, Janson's loose iconographic reading of Wood's adolescence sidesteps accusations of fascism. But it still demonstrates the art historian's broader skepticism about the nature of fact. Other émigré art historians were equally skeptical. In a footnote to his important Studies in Iconology of 1939, Erwin Panofsky wrote that in historical and scientific fields, quote, the individual observation assumes the character of a fact only when it can be related to another analogous observation in such a way that the whole series seems to make sense, end quote. As German art historians fled from Nazi Germany to the United States, they brought with them a science of iconography, which was predicated on the idea that observation became knowledge only through a process of interpretation, only if all the facts added up through interpretation. Even Janson's History of Art textbook from 1962 denies the existence of simple facts in art history, identifying these apparently objective pieces of information as sleeping dogs that had yet to be awoken by the scholar. Thus, my central claim today is that Janson's seemingly unrelated objections to regionalism, whether embodied in the artist's anecdote about a chicken or in Wood's painting's resemblance to German new objectivity, originated in a denial of the fact and a claim for knowledge as a series of interrelated critical interpretations. So I'm going to argue this in the time that remains by telling you a bit about Janson's influential and exceptional career in the United States, by tracing some of the competing understandings and interpretations of regionalism that developed among Janson, Wood, and also some others. And then I'll try to think a little bit at the end about how these claims might help us to understand regionalism, as well as understand more general questions about how we make art and how we tell art stories. So first I want to briefly introduce you to Janson, who you see here in photographs from 1936. And through him, I'll give you a bit of the shifting context of art history in the mid-1930s, when regionalism was really at the height of its influence as an art movement in the United States. In April 1933, Germany's Nazi government banned all non-Aryans from employment in civil service, schools, and universities. Most of Janson's art history professors at Hamburg, including his dissertation supervisor, Panofsky, quickly departed or were dismissed. Janson himself was designated an Aryan, but he found that he could continue to receive his government support for his education under the Nazi administration only if he joined a paramilitary sports training camp or if he participated in community service campaigns and then wrote an admiring report on the new regime. So he completes 4 months of community service work in the summer of 1933, and then he wins a fellowship to study at Harvard for the academic year of 1935 to 36. He's trying to figure out a way to get out of Germany. In 1936, he applied and was approved for immigration to the United States. And in so doing, he escapes German military service and begins his graduate studies anew at Harvard. Now, Janson and Panofsky, who you see here on the left, were just 2 of an estimated 250 art historians working in Germany and Austria who immigrated as the Nazis rose to power in the 1930s and 40s. I show you 3 in this image from the 1950s, from Princeton in the 1950s. Those who relocated comprised an estimated 25% of all art historians in Austria and Germany. They went mostly to English-speaking countries, to the United States, to England, and some to Australia. where they spread German art historical approaches, particularly iconology. Those scholars who gained academic employment in the United States, though, found themselves in a radically new academic structure. Because Janson was so young and had not completed his dissertation before leaving Hamburg, he was eligible to begin a new course of study at Harvard. As the art historians Elizabeth Sears and Charlotte Soule-Glass have argued, Janson proved strikingly adaptable to the American context, negotiating the role between insider and outsider in the US educational system throughout his life. When he arrived in the United States, Janson abandoned his German dissertation, which had been on the development of mythological portraits in the Renaissance. And he began a new monographic one on the sculptor Bartolomeo. During the academic year of 1936 to 1937, and this is where these pictures come from, he became a lecturer and docent at the Worcester Art Museum. There he learned the conventions of teaching in an American-style survey course, which differed a lot from Germany's highly specialized, highly focused classes. Art historian Sabine Ekman has proposed that Janson's populist stance on art education, which he honed at Worcester, derived from a belief in the anti-fascist potential of making modern art accessible, which had been strengthened in the wake of Germany's degenerate art exhibition, which was a fascist attack on modern art. Janson's scholarly writing in the United States, however, continued to be inflected by iconographic analysis, those that he had been trained in when he studied in Germany. Although Janson was in his 20s when he immigrated, he embraced many of the populist conventions of American instruction, but he still remained really committed to iconography. When he moved to Iowa in 1939, Janson depended on Lester Longman, who was the only other art historian on the art faculty and also chair of the art department. He depended on Longman to defend him against the enemies he made quickly by sharing his positive views of European modernists, especially Picasso and Klee, and his negative impressions of Grant Wood. Janson recalled, for example, that Longman had had him reinstated after he had been fired for taking his students on a 2-day trip from Iowa here to the Art Institute in early 1940 to visit a Picasso retrospective, and I show you the poster for that retrospective here. Janson's students had, he claimed, been so turned on by the experience that they took Picasso as the theme of their annual Beaux-Arts ball. And here you see an image of that. Although no official record exists of this firing, Janson explained late in his life why he had been dismissed. He asserted that Iowa had been, quote, a hotbed of political and artistic isolationism, with Grant Wood as its patron saint, end quote. Now, that the students and faculty celebrated Picasso at their ball, however, also suggests that Iowa was far from being dominated by isolationism or even by Wood. Nonetheless, Janson's recollections, I think, suggest the difficulties that he faced as a German art historian in Iowa. In the same essay of 1974, where he recalled Iowa's firing him, Janson also theorized the relationship of the artist and the art historian, especially within the university, in ways that return us to Grant Wood. Janson noted that artists aim to cultivate personal and even egocentric approaches, explaining that since the classical period, quote, the highest praise that could be bestowed on an artist was the claim that he had no teacher, implying that he had invented, or rather reinvented, art from scratch, end quote. In contrast, Janson said, the art historian who surveyed a long history of art had to conclude that no such complete reinvention was possible. Even artists without formal training, Janson argued, learned from looking at other works of art. Restating his earlier conclusion about Wood's adolescence, Janson proclaimed, art, in other words, always comes from art. So Janson, writing after World War II, characterized recent art as the result of the art historian's influence on the modern artist. Art historians like himself, he argued, performed a service by exposing artists to the vast storehouse of the past. The modern artist could not expect to learn much, Janson said, in a Department of Art practice, where teaching consisted in, quote, little more than purely technical instruction. And style, he said, had become so closely tied to individual experience that it occupied a place outside the realm of the teachable. Janson argued that art came from other art, and an artist must look to the vital history of past creative work to locate his artistic forebears and to gradually discover his own identity. It was art historians that made this past accessible. Wood also wrote about art education. His most programmatic essay on the subject focused on the personal expression of children. It categorically opposed Janson's argument for art's derivation from other art. Art in the Daily Life of the Child, which you see here, appeared in 1939 as part of the University of Iowa's Child Welfare Pamphlet Series. And it also circulated in Rural America, a journal of the American Country Life Association, which was dedicated to improving conditions for farmers and for rural people. Wood had taught art to children in country schools beginning in 1910 and into the 1920s. Here's a photograph of him teaching in 1924. You can see that's Wood there. For Wood, art was part of life, and he urged parents and teachers to recognize that a child's interest in art was normal, not odd or necessarily talented even. Wood argued that drawing would sharpen perception, making individuals, he said, more alive to the world, able to extract more out of their experience, whatever that experience might be. He advocated giving all children an opportunity to express themselves artistically, not so that they would become professional artists, but so that they would develop into happier, richer people and become better citizens, he said. Wood cited philosopher and educator John Dewey's claim that art was, quote, a quality discernible in everyday experience, rather than an object made by those with talent and acquired by those with leisure and money. Dewey's arguments connecting the art impulse and the social instinct, these are his words, Dewey's, for a vision of creative expression. Dewey tried to think about creative expression as a way to advance what he called the mutual independence of citizens. And these understandings of art and art's potential power underlay Wood's linking of creative expression and citizenship. Wood believed that exposing children to art making in their everyday lives made a vital contribution to democracy. Although Wood praised art for its ability to encourage social interconnections, for him, art was above all personal. He theorized that children came up with their own languages of unique personal symbols to represent the world around them, and he referred to his own drawings that represented striped feathers as grouped arcs. Because children became socially conscious about drawing at the age of around 12, according to Wood, this age represented a crossroads. Children then began to experience disappointment with their personal symbols. They wanted their work to communicate with others. At this stage, lacking what Wood described as the technical proficiency to communicate meanings, children often became frustrated and they gave up on making art. So in his essay, Wood called on teachers to help children individually, to develop their interests and improve their techniques as needed to express their new experiences to others. Children instructed with respect for their individuality would, by expressing that individuality, more readily locate themselves in society, was Wood's claim. Wood, in his text on children's art, defined expression generally, not as an emotional act, but as, quote, a controlled activity involving the selection, organization of materials, of past experiences, and their fusion with present situations to create new forms, end quote. And here we can see him using a scientific language to present art making as a kind of objective process, even as it links personal experiences of the past and the present. Mentioning only briefly why the art student belonged in the university, Wood argued that education in the natural sciences would make artists understand the facts of contemporary life, enabling them to express their own messages to a wider audience. For Janson, in contrast, art history and the humanities in general were devoted to a skeptical interpretation of facts. Thus, the two men disagreed at a fundamental level. The challenge of art education for Wood lay in teaching individual students the skills to represent their world. For Janson, such a claim only masked the true origin of art, which invariably came from other art. In 1943, a year after Wood's death, Janson reviewed the 1942 memorial exhibition of the artist's work staged here at the Art Institute as part of the annual exhibition of painting and sculpture. In this, Janson's first public critique of regionalism, the artist complained of the sales appeal that Wood cultivated by referring in his works to artifacts of his childhood. Janson mentioned the painter's widely publicized search in 1934 for an authentic specimen of old-fashioned red underwear. And here I show you clippings from Wood's scrapbook that cover the search. The artist wanted to use this antique undergarment as a costume for a painting he imagined entitled The Bath, 1880. So he placed advertisements in the Cedar Rapids Gazette, the Chicago Tribune, and the Des Moines Register, which drew attention in both the local and the national news. Time reported that Wood, in 4 days, had received more than 100 offers of underwear, accepting only one set to use as a painting prop. In his recent biography of Wood, Tripp Evans points out that the attention to Wood's advertisement unsettled the artist, who ultimately abandoned this idea for a painting, recoiling, Evans claims, and I think he's right, from any implication that homoeroticism might motivate his collecting of men's underwear. Here, for example, you see the work referred to as a hot sketch. So although Wood's search ultimately didn't help him paint, it inspired Americana experts to praise red flannel. As you see here, this judge is an expert on flannel underwear. And amid lamentations that it had fallen out of favor, the town of Cedar Springs, Michigan, quickly offered to supply the nation, instituting in 1935 a red flannel festival that continues until today. Here I show you the website. As well as a red flannel factory, which is also still in operation. So evidencing the combined reviving and commercializing of a 19th century artifact through art that so bothered Janson, Life magazine returned to Wood's search 5 years later. In a feature entitled, "Search for Grandpa's Red Flannels Starts New Vogue in Women's Pants." The article urged city folks to thank their country cousins for the new fashion in warm underwear, noting a booming interest among college women, and including a photograph of the magazine's red flannel queen, here on right. Wood's search for a material relic that would make his paintings an objective image of his childhood was soon absorbed by revivalist, nationalist, and commercial interests that overwrote any possibility of his own personal nostalgic or queer desire. Both Wood and Janson criticized this coverage in Henry Luce's magazine's Life and Time did publish a letter from Wood in 1935 correcting the record. Wood wanted it to be known that he had actually only been offered 4 pairs of underwear. He complained that the large number hundreds reported in Time had made it appear, quote, as if red flannel still abounds in Iowa. Now, Wood's extensive search had showed that flannel had fallen out of favor across the United States, absent equally in Iowa and in New York by 1935. Thus, Wood accused Time of presenting an outdated image of Iowa, as if the state had been preserved in the 1880s for commercial appeal. Although Wood pushed back against the coverage, his words didn't have the effect of suppressing the narratives created about his work in the popular press. Time deflected Wood's critique with humor, thanking him for, quote, clarifying the underwear fashion in Iowa, end quote, and noting that he had praised the details of the flannels he ultimately had found, including authentic droopiness. For Wood, the coverage of a for Janson, the coverage of a painting Wood had ultimately abandoned was disproportionate to the quality or importance of the work. Although it served, in Janson's view, the magazine's effort to create a nationalist movement celebrating Americana and old-fashioned Midwestern values. Whereas for Wood, the artifact offered a tangible connection with a personal past, for Janson, it indicated a stifling objectivity, easily co-opted by a dangerous nationalism, which was inappropriate for art. In his 1943 article, Janson undermined the idea that art could become purely personal or only American by arguing for the international roots of regionalism. To undo its claim to represent a specific place, Janson cited the popularity of regionalism across the United States. He discussed the coverage in Time and Life, wondering at the contradiction that artwork, quote, supposedly grown out of the local soil of rural America should have so strong an appeal to the inhabitants of New York or Chicago, end quote. Wood had long acknowledged that his work had an international dimension. Wood explained that seeing Northern European old masters in Munich in 1928, something like Jan van Eyck, whose famous painting I show you here, Wood explained that this had been his stylistic epiphany, after which he had moved from loose post-impressionist brushstrokes of his early work, and here I show you an example, to tightly painted and highly detailed canvases, like Stone City. Janson noted that Wood, before his trip to Germany, could have easily seen examples of Flemish work at many American museums, including here at the Art Institute. So Janson suggested a different source for Wood's inspiration. In the Munich galleries in 1928 that were showing paintings in the style of New Objectivity, which Janson described as evidencing an unswerving faith in positive, palpable reality that enabled, paradoxically, quote, a convenient avenue of escape from the deeper problems of the time, end quote. More recent champions of Wood's work have debated the influence of the German New Objectivity. Art historian Joni Kinsey, for example, calls it uncertain, and the great scholar on Wood, Wanda Korn, says it's probably minimal. And Wood's friend and biographer, Park Reinard, deemed the connection bull. Others recently surveying Wood's stylistic development just relay the connection as a matter of fact, forgetting that Janson's effort to establish it arose originally as an insult. None of those arguing about the influence, about these matters of influence in Wood, however, account for the meaning of Janson's claim. Although Janson presented a connection between regionalism and New Objectivity as his own revelatory claim in 1943, in fact, a Frankfurt Illustrated newspaper had published Stone City in March 1931 with a caption deeming the work an example of Nostalgigkeit in America. The German popular magazine provided no critical analysis. Instead, they ran an unrelated detective serial below the image. I really thought this was going to be like revelatory, I was going to know, but no, it's just unrelated. Okay, but anyway, this suggests, its unrelatedness, suggests a link that could have been made at the level of the visible by German audiences. Although it's possible that Janson had seen this issue in Germany, the connection appeared again in the midst of a 1940 investigation of Grant Wood in the Iowa Department during Janson's time there. Lester Longman, chair of Iowa's Department of Art, wrote a number of art world experts to solicit their opinions about Grant Wood as a kind of expert peer review that he hoped would counter Wood's general popularity in Iowa. The response by Alfred Barr, the director of the Museum of Modern Art, whose photograph I show you here, his reaction to Wood was surprisingly positive. He noted that he would be happy to have Wood's American Gothic or his Daughters of the American Revolution at MoMA. He argued that the feeble drawing in the works functioned effectively as, quote, a denial of a certain traditional virtues of good painting in favor of a rather flat, dead, and banal style, end quote. Barr considered Wood's technical shortcomings as a kind of deliberate formal choice that made his paintings modern. Barr lamented in his letter that he had no time to explore the relationship between Wood and the Munich offshoot of New Objectivity, noting only that the forms of the two seemed quite similar to him. In making this comparison, Barr drew on knowledge he had gained while organizing an exhibition of German painting and sculpture at MoMA in 1931. This show about German painting and sculpture featured a small group of painters of New Objectivity. Despite Barr's concern that the museum trustees would see this realist portion as he put it, very reactionary. Barr explained New Objectivity sympathetically as the works of a heterogeneous group of artists who had turned away from expressionism and abstraction toward the objective material world. He described their realism as empathic, that is, focused on representing objects by a detailed characterization of concrete visual facts. Barr traced the name Nostalgigkeit to Gustav F. Hartlaub, who was director of the Mannheim Museum. And in 1925, at the height of political and economic instability in Germany, Hartlaub had curated the first exhibition of works exemplifying this style. Barr quoted at length from Hartlaub's explanation of the group's dual character. Hartlaub had pointed to a right and a left wing of the artists who adopted the style. The Munich painters Georg Schlimpf and Alexander Kennelt formed the right wing, and they produced classical, idealized landscapes with no markers of industry. The Dresden-trained Berliners George Gross and Otto Dix represented the left. Their paintings focused on the kind of seamy underside of contemporary urban life. Although Barr made no reference to the Nazis in his 1940 letter, when Longman linked Wood's painting to Munich New Objectivity, he made it clear to the University of Iowa's administrators that southeastern Germany, where Munich was situated, was home to the politically conservative branch of painters and included artists taken up by the Nazi government. In Germany, Nostalgigkeit opened a question that remained unresolved. Was objectivity inherently bourgeois, or was it radical? These paintings focused equally on every detail, transforming even nature into a kind of object. This is what critics called their thingness, the kind of mechanized detail of painting, seemed both anti-aesthetic and also anti-humanist. The style also became closely associated in Germany, however, with a streamlined American modernity, which was based on functionalism, commercialism, and fashion. And the right wing couldn't embrace those influences. Indeed, Hartlaub and the leftist painters came under political attack as Hitler rose to power. The National Socialist government dismissed the curator, and George Gross flees to America. but painters associated with the conservative classical aspects of the style, including Kleinhold and Schimpf in Munich, they gained and accepted the favor of the Nazi government, at least in the mid-1930s. Janson ultimately acknowledged that any contact on Wood's part with Newstocklichkeit painting would remain speculative. The art historian suggested that it actually mattered little whether Wood had conceived his style independently, but he said that the styles were so similar they should be considered analogous phenomenon. Janson inventoried the overlaps between Wood's style and the work of the right-wing New Objectivity painters, which he deemed Nazi in terms of subject matter, personal style, and method. He attacked Wood's focus on, quote, idyllic aspects of rural and small-town life, his insistence on being unsophisticated and normal, his abhorrence of spontaneity, evidenced in painstakingly calculated compositions, as well as by his dry and laborious tempera technique, with its emphasis upon neatness, precision, and craftsmanship, end quote. Janson argued that Wood, in a period of crisis, provided a vision of stability and security, a kind of escapist realism that reduced history to personal anecdote, creating, as Janson put it, a substitute reality. Although Janson mentioned Hollywood films in his critique of escapism, his analysis of Wood's painting evokes the writing of another critic of Newstocklichkeit, the film theorist Siegfried Kracauer, who wrote of a parallel new realism in film. Kracauer focused on the problem of facts, too. The facts whose volume, he said, overwhelmed, so much that it was impossible to ask questions, to make judgments, or to take sides. Reality, Kracauer wrote, quote, is portrayed not so as to make facts yield their implications, but to drown all implications in a sea of facts, end quote. The style marked for Kracauer a state of paralysis, a disillusionment with the present that evidenced a mentality declined to commit itself in any direction. Newstocklichkeit, in rendering objective representations in paint or in film, offered not a politically engaged realism, but a kind of morally ambivalent avenue of escapism. So in 1946, Janson critiqued regionalism even more forcefully. Whereas he had argued in his earlier articles for regionalism's international and potentially fascist character, immediately following World War II, he set out to prove it was, quote, essentially anti-artistic in its aims and character, end quote. Janson focused here on Wood and Thomas Hart Benton, the later the only artist of the Regionalist trio still alive in 1946. Janson's article illustrated Soane City of 1930 and Dinner for Threshers of 1934. The two works, according to Janson, seemed to offer a level of detail that was more encyclopedic than realist, an inventory rather than an interpretation. Janson argued that regionalism opposed recent art. At the same time, it refused to uphold the values of the past. Despite using the tempera and oil glazes of old masters, Janson deemed regionalist art, quote, bad painting, judged according to either Renaissance or modern standards. Regionalists, he said, discussed neither style, form, or design, but they judged painting only by its depicted content. Janson described regionalism as an assertion that the subject matter of a work of art should originate in personal experience, but only in the experience of certain types. Prizing scenes of farm life over those depicted in an urban environment full of, in Janson's words, alien influence, Janson complained that regionalists had replaced aesthetic values with Americanism, i.e. nationalism. Janson argued that all great art was humanist. It was located in a long history of art, rather than nationalist, based on a single national or regional experience. You'll recall Museum of Modern Art curator Alfred Barr had initially been the first to describe a sustained connection between regionalism and new objectivity. But his sympathetic reading of Wood's painting, that its technical shortcomings did a kind of conceptual work to subvert virtuosity, totally fell out of Janson's subsequent arguments about regionalism. Janson argued that Wood's images and his persona could be appropriated for any commercial or political end. The moral ambivalence of Wood's objectivity made it popular, but it also made it dangerous. In regionalism, facts became overwhelming. Janson argued that artwork and scholarship necessitated interpretation, making judgments and presenting a view of the world. German art critics, the ones I've quoted, provide a more complex background for Janson's comparison, one that's essential given the German immigrants, art historians' firsthand experience of Neustädtlichkeit painting in interwar Germany. Indeed, the German reception helps explain the stakes of the disagreement, and it shows how a style that prized fact and objectivity could ultimately be deemed anti-realist in its politics. Although many contemporary students probably associate Janson and his textbook with facts that they are forced to memorize, that are often included in the art history survey, an artist's name, the painting's title, its date, Janson noted in the preface to the first edition of his art history that his book's title referred both to the events that make history and to the scholarly discipline that deals with those events. His words here, he said, identify the record and its interpretation. Those were inseparable. At the outset of his textbook, Janson explained to readers, quote, "There are no plain facts in the history of art, or in the history of anything else for that matter, only degrees of plausibility," end quote. Facts seem to exist only as long as they go unquestioned, he said. They lie like, quote, sleeping dogs whose very inertness makes them landmarks on the scholarly terrain, end quote. The possibilities of facts stirred to their wakefulness and locomotion, he said, fascinate the scholar. Thus, even in his textbook, Janson took an ambivalent view on the value of facts, locating history and art as an ongoing interpretation, a humanities that would take nothing as given, but would engage always critically with the world. In 2007, in an abrupt turn, the 7th edition of Janson's History of Art featured Grant Wood's American Gothic. This is a terrible image that I took. But since its release in 1962, the textbook had been updated by Janson, and following his sudden death in 1982 by Janson's son, Anthony F. Janson, and it had always left Wood out. The book had been subject to criticism for its Eurocentrism and the dearth of female artists in it. And the 7th edition marked the first edition that was revised without any input from Janson's family. The authors are the people that you see listed below. Here. So Wood's painting is described as the most famous of those created by regionalists. And the book gives a few interpretations before concluding, as you see at the end here, quote, "But regardless of the interpretations, no one seemed to deny that the picture seemed to capture something fundamentally American and especially Midwestern," end quote. The repeated use of seems in this short sentence, I think, suggests the ways that regionalism still sits uneasily within the canonical history of art, even as it's kind of wedged in because of the fame of its images. Rather than claiming to codify what constituted American or even Midwestern at a fundamental level, Wood and his fellow regionalists each claimed to offer their own interpretations of local landscapes to which they had a personal connection. In the mid-1930s, national fame did signal to regionalists the success of their artworks. But as we've seen just a decade later, that same fame suggested to critics like Janson an easy consumption, redolent of economic consumerism and political propaganda that would rob viewers of critical judgment. Now, it's the job of textbooks to simplify for beginning students. And I believe regionalism does belong in the canon of art's Western tradition. However, I also believe that we lose crucial insights on that tradition when a book with Janson's name on it betrays the art historian's own opposition to regionalism. And I also wonder if it's any coincidence that Grant Wood appears in our canon during the early 20th century era in which fame equates so easily with importance. Battles about regionalism were sometimes personal, and they were definitely sometimes petty, but they also cut to the core of fundamental questions about what making and studying art should teach us. Thinking about the case of the naked chicken reveals many familiar debates about art's utility that help us understand its value, not only in how it can be mobilized to make money or gain fame. If we learn from Wood and Janson with the distance of history, I hope we can understand the ways creating and viewing art might teach us both to make our own meaning and to critically engage with the meanings delivered to us by others. Thank you.